Nikolai Volkov took a deep breath as he stared at the rusted iron gate of the house he had not set foot in for 18 years. At 37 years old, he had become one of the most feared and powerful men on the East Coast, the head of the Volkov Syndicate, a name that made even hardened criminals tremble. But this modest house in the heart of Brooklyn represented everything he wanted to bury about his painful past: the poverty, the hunger, the nights his mother worked 3 jobs just to keep him alive. Now he needed to sell this property to erase the last trace of the weak boy he used to be. His right-hand man Viktor stood beside him, hand instinctively reaching for his weapon when they noticed smoke rising from the chimney and fresh curtains hanging in the windows of what should have been an abandoned house. The woman who appeared at the door was clearly terrified and tried to hide a small boy behind her. Nikolai noticed her faded gray dress hanging loosely on her thin frame and the protective way she clutched a 4-year-old boy in her arms, while a little girl around 7 years old clung desperately to her dirty skirt. She could not hide the panic in her striking green eyes when she realized they had been discovered, but there was something else in those eyes. A fierce determination, the look of someone who had suffered too much to fear anything anymore. She spoke in a trembling voice, begging him to let her explain. Nikolai asked how they got in here while trying to maintain his cold composure, as he observed the state of the house that should have been empty. The woman lowered her head and held the child tighter, then said her name was Amelia Hart, and the house had looked abandoned for years, and they had nowhere else to go. Nikolai studied her for a long moment, noticing the faded bruises on her wrists and the old scar peeking from her collar, and something deep within his frozen heart stirred for the first time in years. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a good tale. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss another emotional story like this one. Now let us continue to see what the most dangerous man in Brooklyn will do when he meets the one woman who might just change everything. Nikolai stood there for a long moment in silence, his cold, gray eyes never leaving the woman who was clutching the child tightly in front of him. He could have ordered Viktor to throw them out immediately, could have called the police to have them arrested for trespassing, could have done anything a powerful mafia boss like him usually did to people who dared touch what belonged to him. But instead, he heard his own voice rise in its familiar chill, telling her she had 1 week, just 1 week, to find somewhere else and leave. Amelia lifted her head to look at him, her emerald gaze wide because she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. She stammered out her thanks, promising they'd go without causing any more trouble. Nikolai didn't respond, only turned and walked toward the sleek black Maybach waiting outside the gate. Viktor hurried after him, his gaze full of questions, but he knew this wasn't the moment to ask. As the car rolled away from the worn-down street in Brooklyn, Nikolai glanced into the rearview mirror and saw Amelia still standing in the doorway, her thin silhouette pressed against the backdrop of the sagging house like a portrait of loneliness and despair. He faced forward again, jaw clenched as he tried to drive that image from his mind. Viktor finally asked why he'd given them time instead of throwing them out right away, saying it didn't feel like Nikolai Volkov, the man who had never softened for anyone. Nikolai answered coldly that he simply didn't want to get tangled up with police and annoying paperwork, that a week wouldn't change anything, but they both knew it was a lie. All the way back to Manhattan, Nikolai couldn't stop thinking about those green eyes, about the way Amelia held her spine straight as she shielded the 2 children even though she was clearly trembling with fear, about the faint bruises on her wrist and the old scar half hidden at the edge of her collar. She didn't look at him with the kind of fear everyone else usually wore around him, but with the gaze of someone who'd endured too much pain to be afraid of anything anymore. That gaze was exactly like his mother's in those years when she was worn down from working herself to the bone just to raise him. When he reached the luxurious penthouse atop the tallest building in Manhattan, Nikolai went into his study and closed the door. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, then stood before the wall of glass, looking down at the city blazing with lights below. He'd built everything he had with blood and tears, with ruthlessness and no mercy. He'd killed every fragile feeling inside himself to become the man he was today. So why could one nameless woman with 2 children make him feel as if something was stirring inside the heart that had been frozen for so many years? Nikolai set the glass down and picked up his phone to call his lawyer. He said the sale of the house in Brooklyn would have to be delayed, maybe a month or longer. He hadn't decided. On the other end, the lawyer sounded surprised and asked if there was a problem, because the buyer was growing impatient. Nikolai replied shortly that there was no problem. He just needed more time, and then he hung up. He stared into the New York night, but in his mind there was only the image of the old Brooklyn house and the woman with those unbreakable green eyes. That night Nikolai couldn't sleep. He lay on the vast bed in the elegant room and felt emptier than he ever had. He wondered what Amelia and the two children were doing in a house without proper heat in the middle of Brooklyn's bitter winter night, and he hated himself for the fact that it bothered him. 3 days passed, and Nikolai realized he couldn't focus on any work at all. Meetings with partners, million-dollar deals, life or death decisions in the underworld all faded into nothing beside the image of the woman with that hauntingly beautiful gaze that kept haunting his mind. On the morning of the 4th day, he woke up and told himself he needed to go check whether they were following the agreement, that it was only the responsibility of a property owner and nothing more. Viktor watched him with open suspicion when Nikolai ordered the car prepared for Brooklyn, but the loyal man said nothing, only carried it out in silence. When the black Maybach stopped in front of the old house, Nikolai stepped out and immediately noticed the difference. The rusty gate had been scrubbed clean, the wild weeds choking the front yard had been cut back neatly, and there were wildflowers arranged in old cans on the steps. A small, stubborn attempt to bring life back to the place. Nikolai walked into the yard and saw Amelia hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 weathered posts. She was still wearing the same faded gray dress from before, but it had been washed and pressed smooth. When she saw him, Amelia was clearly surprised and uneasy, asking if something had happened, her voice edged with anxiety. Nikolai said he'd only come to check, then walked inside without waiting for an invitation. What he saw stopped him cold. The house he remembered as dusty and web-covered was now unbelievably clean. The old curtains had been washed and rehung straight. The wooden floors were wiped to a shine, and the worn furniture from the storage room had been dragged out and arranged carefully, turning the space into something warm and lived in. There was the smell of simple food from the kitchen, the soft giggle of children from the next room, and late afternoon sunlight pouring through spotless windows onto wildflowers standing in an old glass jar. Nikolai moved toward the corner where a small wooden table stood, a few books stacked on top. Emma was sitting there, reading aloud to Ethan, her voice still unpolished but determined. When they saw Nikolai, both children went silent and stared at him with frightened eyes. Nikolai didn't react to them. He only lifted the top book from the stack. His heart seemed to miss a beat when he recognized it as the fairy tale book his mother used to read to him every night before sleep. He opened to the first page and saw the crooked handwriting of his own from when he'd been an 8-year-old boy, saying the book belonged to Nikolai Volkov, 3rd grade. Memories rushed in like a wave. Bitter winter nights with his mother holding him close and reading in a gentle Russian voice. The scent of bread she baked on Sunday mornings. Her laughter when he asked innocent questions. Amelia stepped into the room, and when she saw the book in his hands, she panicked at once, saying she was sorry. She'd found them in the attic, and hadn't known they were his. She'd tell Emma to return them right away. Emma stood up, tears in her eyes, hands trembling as she held the book out toward Nikolai, ready to give back the thing she treasured. Nikolai looked at the 7-year-old child with curly brown hair and wide eyes full of fear. Then he looked down at the book in his hand. He'd lost his mother. He'd lost his childhood. He'd lost every last bit of innocence a long time ago. These books were only relics from a past he'd tried to bury, but to Emma, they were an entire enchanted world. Nikolai set the book down on the table in front of Emma and said she could keep them. Emma's eyes widened, unable to believe what she'd heard, asking again if it was real, if she could truly keep the books. Nikolai nodded, then turned to Amelia and asked who had taught Emma to read. Amelia said she'd taught her herself, that she'd only studied through 4th grade. But she tried to teach Emma everything she knew. Nikolai looked at the woman in front of him, a girl only 27 years old who had carried the responsibility of raising 2 younger siblings in desperate circumstances, who had turned an abandoned house into a home, who had tried to give her sister a better future even though she herself had nothing. And for the first time in many years, Nikolai felt something other than coldness and cruelty rising in his chest. Amelia offered Nikolai a cup of coffee, and he didn't know why he agreed. They sat in the small kitchen, where Amelia had cleaned everything until it looked almost new, and arranged the worn cooking tools she'd found in the house with careful order. Emma had led Ethan outside to play, and the laughter of the 2 children drifted in through the window frame like a strangely peaceful melody in Nikolai's life of violence. He took a sip of coffee and asked Amelia why she lived like this, why a young woman had to raise 2 younger siblings alone in an abandoned house. Amelia stayed silent for a long time, her green eyes lowered to the cup in her hands as if she were searching for the courage to speak a story she'd tried to bury for years. Then she began to tell him that her mother had died of cancer 5 years ago, that the disease was found too late and they hadn't had money for treatment. She'd taken every job she could to earn money for her mother's medicine, but in the end it still wasn't enough. Her mother died when Emma was only 2 years old, and Ethan was still in the belly of another woman, the woman her stepfather had been sleeping with while her mother was dying in a hospital bed. That woman abandoned Ethan right after giving birth, and Amelia's stepfather didn't want the child. He planned to give Ethan away. But Amelia had taken her brother and sworn she'd raise him herself. Her stepfather was a drunk and a violent man. He beat her whenever he was drunk and blamed her for everything terrible in his life. As she said this, Amelia unconsciously lifted a hand to rub her wrist, and her sleeve slipped down, exposing the tangled web of old scars on her pale skin. Nikolai saw those scars and his jaw clenched, his gray eyes darkening with a fury he couldn't understand. A fury that rose so hard and fast it almost felt like it didn't belong to him. Amelia realized he was looking, and quickly pulled her sleeve back down, her cheeks flushing with shame. She said it was in the past, that she'd taken Emma and Ethan and run from her stepfather 6 months earlier when he'd tried to sell her to a loan shark to pay off gambling debts. They'd wandered everywhere, sleeping in abandoned storage sheds, in parks, under bridges, until they found this house. Amelia looked Nikolai straight in the eyes with all the pride she had left, and said she knew they had no right to be here. She knew they'd have to leave, but she begged him not to think she was a beggar or something pitiful. She was only a sister trying to protect her siblings. Nikolai looked at the woman in front of him and saw the shadow of his mother in her, the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him, who'd worked herself to exhaustion and never complained once. He stood up, and Amelia stood up too, bracing herself to hear that the 1-week deadline still stood. But instead, Nikolai said she had 1 month. 1 month to stay and find steady work. 1 month to put a future together for herself and for the children. Amelia stared at him, mouth parted, unable to believe what she was hearing, and asked why he was helping them like this. Nikolai didn't answer. He only walked out the door and called back that he'd send people to fix the roof and the heating system. Winter in Brooklyn was cold, and he didn't want his house to fall into worse disrepair. He drove away without looking back. But in the rearview mirror he saw Amelia still standing there, watching him with tear-filled eyes. 1 week after Nikolai sent people to repair the roof and install a heating system, the biggest storm in 20 years slammed into Brooklyn without any warning early enough to matter. That night, Nikolai was sitting in his penthouse watching the weather report when the anchor announced that the storm had shifted course without warning and was tearing through Brooklyn, with winds reaching 150 kilometers an hour. His heart tightened at the thought of the old house, of Amelia and the 2 children inside it, a place that, even with repairs, still couldn't withstand a storm that destructive. He called Amelia, but no one picked up, so he called again, a second time, a third time, a fourth time, and still there was only the long, hopeless dial tone. Nikolai grabbed his car keys and rushed out despite Viktor shouting that going outside in weather like this was insane. He didn't care. He only knew that 3 people needed him, and he couldn't sit in a warm apartment while they might be in danger. Nikolai drove through sheets of rain, the wind so violent that even the heavy Maybach swayed on the road. Trees snapped and fell in every direction. Streetlights went dead, and all of Brooklyn sank into darkness and chaos. When he arrived, his heart dropped into an abyss at the sight of part of the roof ripped away by the wind, rainwater pouring into the house in relentless torrents. He ran inside and found Amelia holding Emma and Ethan tight in the only corner that was still dry, all 3 soaked through and shaking in bone deep cold. Emma lay in Amelia's arms with her face flushed from fever, her small lips cracked and dry, her breathing heavy in a way that was terrifying. Amelia lifted her head to Nikolai, her eyes full of tears and desperation, and said that Emma had been running a fever since the afternoon, but she couldn't take her to the hospital because the storm was too fierce, and she was afraid that if they went outside all 3 of them would die. Nikolai didn't say a word. He pulled off his expensive coat and wrapped it around Emma, then lifted the child into his arms. He ordered Amelia to carry Ethan and follow him, his voice hard and allowing no argument. They ran to the car through the pounding rain, wind lashing their bodies like blades. But Nikolai used his own body to shield Emma and guided Amelia through the chaos. Once they were all safely inside the car, Nikolai drove like a madman through the storm toward Manhattan, one hand on the wheel, the other repeatedly checking Emma's forehead as she lay in the back seat with Amelia holding her close. The little girl was drifting in and out, and now and then she whimpered and called for her sister, while Amelia sobbed and told Emma it would be okay, that she was here, that she wouldn't let anything happen to her. Nikolai glanced into the rearview mirror and told Amelia he'd call his private doctor the moment they got back, that Emma would be fine, he promised. Amelia looked at him through tears, and for the first time she saw that behind the cold, ruthless mask of a powerful mafia boss, there was a man with a heart. They reached Nikolai's secure apartment in an upscale building. Not his penthouse, but a secret place he used when he needed to disappear. He carried Emma into the master bedroom and laid her on the bed, then immediately called Dr. Nathan Shaw. Amelia stood by the bed holding Ethan, who was crying from fear, and she watched Nikolai issue anxious orders into the phone, wondering why a man like him would risk his life in the middle of a storm to save 3 strangers like them. When Dr. Shaw arrived and began examining Emma, Nikolai stood just outside the doorway, his clothes still drenched with rain, but he didn't care. He only stood there, gray eyes fixed on the little girl on the bed, and on the woman gripping her hand with a face full of worry. And that night, while the storm howled beyond the windows, Nikolai Volkov realized his life had changed forever from the moment he first saw those unbreakable, striking gaze. Dr. Nathan Shaw was a 50-year-old man with graying hair and kind eyes, and he'd worked for Nikolai for more than 10 years without ever asking a single question about the strange injuries he was sometimes required to treat. But tonight, as he watched Nikolai standing outside the bedroom door with a worried gaze fixed on a 7-year-old child, he knew something had changed in this cold man. After the examination, Dr. Shaw stepped out and told Nikolai that Emma had pneumonia from exposure to the cold, that it was fairly serious, but with proper care she'd recover within 1 week. Amelia heard the word pneumonia, and her legs gave out. She leaned against the wall and sobbed, blaming herself for not protecting her sister, for letting her suffer in that leaking house in the middle of the storm. Nikolai came to her and set a hand on her shoulder, awkward and unsure, and he told her it wasn't her fault, that Emma would be okay. Amelia lifted her head, eyes red and swollen, and asked why he was being so good to them, who he was to be able to call a doctor in the middle of a stormy night, to have a hidden apartment and a team of people working for him like a king. Nikolai was silent for a moment, then said he was someone she shouldn't know, that his world was dangerous and brutal. But tonight she and the children should rest. Everything else could wait. Dr. Shaw gave the injection and left the necessary instructions behind before departing, and Ethan had fallen asleep on the sofa after crying himself to exhaustion. Amelia sat beside Emma's bed, fingers clenched around her sister's hand, her eyes never leaving the small face that still breathed heavily in sleep. Nikolai brought her a cup of hot tea, then sat in the chair across from her, saying nothing, only keeping watch like a quiet night guard. When the clock struck 2 a.m, Amelia turned to him and asked why he wasn't sleeping. He'd already done too much for them. Nikolai said he couldn't sleep, that he'd been used to staying up through the night for a long time. Amelia studied him for a moment, then asked if he could tell her about himself, because she wanted to understand why a man as powerful as he was would care about 3 homeless people like them. Nikolai looked out the window where the storm was still screaming beyond the glass, and he began to speak, for the first time in many years telling someone about his childhood. He told her about his mother, an immigrant woman from Russia who had raised him alone after his father walked away. She worked 3 jobs every day so he'd have food and clothes, and she read to him every night even when she was so exhausted she'd fall asleep in the middle of the story. She died from overwork when he was 19, and he'd sworn he'd never allow himself to be poor and powerless like that again. He climbed to the top of the underworld with blood and tears, with ruthlessness and no mercy. But sometimes he wondered whether his mother would be proud of the man he'd become. Amelia listened in silence. Then she reached out and took his hand, and she said she thought his mother would be proud because tonight he'd saved 3 lives, because deep inside him there was still the heart his mother had raised. Nikolai looked down at the small hand holding his and felt something warm spread through his chest, a sensation he'd forgotten for a very long time. They sat like that until the first light of dawn pierced the black storm clouds, as they finally began to break apart, their hands still clasped together as if it were the most natural thing in the world. While Nikolai and Amelia were living through rare moments of peace, somewhere else in the city the darkness was rising. Bruno Castellano walked out through the gates of a federal prison with hatred in his eyes and a fury that had been smoldering through 6 months of confinement. He was a brutal loan shark, the owner of a chain of filthy nightclubs, and the son of Frank Castellano, a mafia boss rivaling the Volkov syndicate. Bruno was 42, with a massive build, a scarred face, and reptile cold eyes that always made people shudder in fear. The first thing he did after getting out was call Rico, his most trusted right hand, and ask about Amelia. Rico reported that the girl had vanished without a trace since the day Bruno was arrested, and no one knew where she was or where she'd run. Bruno's teeth ground as he heard it. He smashed his phone against the wall and roared that he'd find the girl even if she hid at the very bottom of hell. Amelia was his property, a debt her stepfather had sold to him, and no one was allowed to take what belonged to Bruno Castellano. He'd spent 3 years breaking her, turning her from an innocent girl into an obedient thing in his club. He remembered perfectly how she trembled whenever he came close, remembered the sound of her crying and begging when he punished her for daring to try to run, remembered the long scar across her back that he himself had carved, a reminder that she belonged to him. And now the girl had dared to flee while he was in prison, dared to drag along 2 useless younger siblings and disappear as if she could ever escape him. Bruno ordered every one of his men to scour New York, and he put up a reward of $50,000 for anyone with information about Amelia Hart, a 27-year-old woman with brown hair and green eyes who was caring for 2 small children. Word spread fast through the underworld, and within 2 weeks, one of Bruno's underlings found the first lead. Someone had seen a woman matching the description living in an old house in Brooklyn, an area inside Volkov syndicate territory. Bruno frowned when he heard the name Volkov. He knew who Nikolai Volkov was, knew he was dangerous enough that even his father had to tread carefully. But he didn't believe a powerful mafia boss like Nikolai would get involved with a nameless girl like Amelia. Rico suggested going to Brooklyn to verify the information, and Bruno agreed, warning Rico to be careful and not draw attention on Volkov territory. Rico took 2 underlings into Brooklyn one afternoon and started probing for news. He questioned the locals, pretending he was looking for a missing relative, and finally an old woman in the neighborhood accidentally revealed that a young woman with 2 children had been living in the abandoned house at the end of the street a few months ago, but recently she'd been picked up by a wealthy man after the night of the great storm. Rico returned and reported to Bruno, and when Bruno heard it, his eyes looked ready to burst with rage. A wealthy man had come and taken Amelia away, which meant someone was holding his property. Bruno decided he would find out who that man was and make him pay dearly, because no one was allowed to steal what belonged to Bruno Castellano without suffering the consequences. The next morning, Viktor walked into Nikolai's office with a grave expression and reported that someone was asking questions about Amelia in the Brooklyn area. Nikolai, seated behind his desk, lifted his head at once, his gray eyes turning cold in an instant as the words landed. Viktor said his men had spotted 3 unfamiliar men in the neighborhood near the old house, going door to door asking about a young woman with 2 children and pretending they were searching for a missing relative. One of them had been identified as Rico, the most trusted enforcer of Bruno Castellano. When Nikolai heard the name Bruno Castellano, he shot up from his chair and demanded that Viktor tell him everything about that man. Viktor explained that Bruno was the son of Frank Castellano, one of the Volkov syndicate's long-standing rivals, and that he'd gotten out of prison 2 weeks ago after serving 6 months for illegal weapons possession. Bruno was notorious for brutality, running a loan shark network and owning multiple infamous nightclubs across the city. Nikolai ordered Viktor to dig deeper into the connection between Bruno and Amelia. He wanted everything, every smallest detail, nothing missed. 2 days later, Viktor returned with a thick file and a face gone bleak, as if what he'd found was worse than even he had expected. Nikolai opened the file and began to read, and with every page he turned, his jaw tightened harder, his eyes darkening as rage started to boil through his veins. The file stated that Amelia's stepfather had sold her to Bruno more than 3 years ago to pay off a gambling debt worth $50,000. Amelia had been only 24 then, a young woman who'd just lost her mother and was raising 2 small siblings on her own. Bruno had turned her into property, keeping her locked in an apartment and forcing her to work in his nightclub like a decorative piece meant to entertain his guests. The file included photographs Viktor had gathered through underworld sources, images of Amelia with bruises on her face and body, with eyes hollow and hopeless, the look of someone whose spirit had been broken. There was a medical report from an underground clinic stating Amelia had been admitted twice during those 3 years, once for broken ribs and once for severe blood loss from an injury across her back, the long scar Nikolai had glimpsed before. She had tried to escape twice, and both times Bruno found her. The first time he beat her until her ribs broke to teach her a lesson. The second time he used a knife to carve a long line across her back as a warning that next time she wouldn't come back with only a scar. Nikolai finished the file and threw it onto the desk, his hands shaking with anger he could barely contain. He had killed men. He had done ruthless things in the underworld, but he had never treated a woman that way. His mother had taught him that a real man never lays a hand on women and children, and Bruno Castellano had violated that rule in the most disgusting way possible. Viktor asked Nikolai how he wanted to handle it, and Nikolai answered in a voice cold as ice that first he needed to speak with Amelia. He needed to hear the truth from her own mouth, and after that, Bruno Castellano would pay for every tear and every scar he had left on her. Nikolai went to the safe apartment that afternoon, where Amelia and the children were staying after the stormy night. Emma was much better and was sitting on the sofa reading with Ethan, the two of them laughing and playing, unaware that the shadow from the past was slowly closing in. Amelia opened the door and her face brightened when she saw him, but that smile died fast when she noticed how rigid his expression was, how unusually cold those gray eyes looked. He stepped inside and asked to speak with her alone, his voice so low and grave that Amelia felt a chill slide down her spine. She led him into the kitchen and closed the door so the children wouldn't hear. Nikolai stood across from her and asked bluntly who Bruno Castellano was and why he was combing all over Brooklyn looking for her. Amelia looked as if she'd been struck by lightning at the sound of that name, her face draining white, her legs shaking so hard she had to grip the table to keep from collapsing. In a thin, broken voice, she asked how he knew about Bruno, and Nikolai said he knew everything that happened on his territory, that Bruno was looking for her and he needed the truth. Amelia closed her eyes and tears began to trail down her cheeks, because she knew she couldn't hide it anymore. She knew this moment would come sooner or later. She began to tell him, this time not in fragments like before, but the whole story of the 3 years of hell she'd lived through. She told him about the night her stepfather, drunk, dragged her in front of Bruno and declared she belonged to him from that moment on to settle the debt, about the way Bruno looked at her like merchandise and nodded his agreement. She told him about the small apartment where he kept her locked up, about the nights she had to stand in his club and entertain customers under Rico's watch, about the lashes and beatings whenever she dared look at someone the wrong way or said one word out of place. She told him about the first time she tried to run, and Bruno beat her until 2 ribs broke, then locked her in a dark room for 1 week without food or water, about the second time she risked everything to escape, and he found her after only 2 days. When she reached that part, Amelia stopped and went silent for a long moment. Then she turned her back to Nikolai and slowly lifted her shirt, revealing bare skin and a long scar slashing diagonally from her right shoulder down to her left waist. The wound had healed, but it was still red and rough, a permanent mark of the brutality she'd endured. In a trembling voice, she said Bruno had done it to remind her she belonged to him, that no matter where she ran, he would find her, and next time it wouldn't be only a scar. Nikolai stared at the long scar across her back, and the rage inside him flared like a fire that burned away every shred of reason. He stepped closer and reached out to touch it gently, his fingers shaking as they felt the roughened skin beneath his fingertips. Amelia shuddered at the contact, but she didn't pull away. She simply stood there and let him see everything she'd hidden for so long. Nikolai asked in a voice thick with fury why she hadn't told him sooner, why she'd carried all of this alone without telling anyone. Amelia lowered her shirt and turned to face him, green eyes soaked with tears but still unbreakable, the same way they had been the first day he saw her. She said she was scared that if she told him he'd throw her out because he wouldn't want trouble, scared that Bruno would find her and this time he wouldn't spare her. She said she could endure anything, but she couldn't let Emma and Ethan be hurt because the children were everything she had in this world. Nikolai stepped in and gripped her shoulders, looked straight into her eyes, and said in a voice cold as steel but carrying a vow that no one would ever touch her again. No one would be allowed to lay a hand on what belonged to him. Amelia stared at him, eyes wide, and asked what he meant by saying she belonged to him. Nikolai didn't answer. He only pulled her into his arms and held her tight as if he meant to shield her from every darkness in the world. And in that warm embrace, Amelia sobbed for the first time, not from pain or fear, but because at last she felt safe. Immediately after his conversation with Amelia, Nikolai called an emergency meeting with every senior member of the Volkov syndicate. They gathered in a secret meeting room beneath the basement of a Russian restaurant Nikolai owned in Manhattan, a place where no listening device or surveillance could ever penetrate. Viktor stood to Nikolai's right, as always, while 12 other men sat around a massive oak table, all of them silent, waiting for their leader to speak. Nikolai stood at the head of the table and declared in a voice that allowed no disagreement that from this moment on, Amelia Hart and her 2 younger siblings were under the protection of the Volkov syndicate, and anyone who laid a hand on them would face the full force of the organization. A few men exchanged startled looks because Nikolai Volkov had never used the resources of the entire syndicate to protect any woman before, but no one dared question him out loud. Nikolai ordered 4 guards assigned to Amelia 24 hours a day, every day, and he wanted to know every move Bruno Castellano made and exactly where he was at all times. Then he turned to Viktor and told him to send a message to Bruno, to let him know Amelia Hart was under Nikolai Volkov's protection, and if he wanted to touch her, he'd have to step over the bodies of the entire Volkov syndicate. Viktor nodded and carried out the order at once. The message was delivered the way the underworld always did it. A black envelope containing a silver bullet engraved with the letter V was placed at the door of Bruno's apartment, along with a short note stating that Amelia Hart belonged to Volkov, and any action against her would be considered a declaration of war on the Volkov syndicate. Bruno was sitting in his living room when Rico brought the envelope in, and he opened it. And when he read the line on the paper, he roared like a wounded beast and hurled the glass table in front of him into the wall until it shattered. He couldn't believe Nikolai Volkov, the boss of the Volkov syndicate, would dare interfere in his business, would dare declare ownership over something Bruno had spent 3 years breaking into obedience. Bruno asked Rico with a voice full of hatred what Nikolai Volkov had to do with Amelia and since when the girl had been protected by someone that powerful. Rico shook his head and said he didn't know. But it seemed Amelia had been living in Nikolai's old house in Brooklyn for months, and somehow she'd caught the Mafia boss's attention. Bruno ground his teeth and decided he needed help from someone strong enough to stand against Volkov. He drove to his father's mansion in the suburbs of New York and stormed into Frank Castellano's study with rage on his face. Frank was 65, with white silver hair and eyes sharp as knives, one of the most seasoned Mafia bosses on the East Coast, and he'd been locked in conflict with the Volkov syndicate for decades. Bruno told his father everything and demanded he help him take Amelia back, saying it wasn't only personal, it was a matter of the Castellano family's honor. Frank listened in silence, then sighed and said his son was playing with fire, that Nikolai Volkov wasn't someone to toy with, he was a cold-blooded monster who would burn the whole world down if anyone touched something he cared about. Bruno argued that Amelia was only a nameless girl, that there was no reason Nikolai would risk a war with the Castellanos over her. Frank looked at his son with a troubled gaze and said that if Nikolai had publicly declared protection over that girl, it meant she mattered to him, and that made everything far more dangerous. But in the end, Frank still agreed to help his son. He said he would contact allies and prepare forces, but Bruno had to promise he wouldn't act rashly before everything was ready. Bruno agreed, and as he left his father's mansion, he stared toward Manhattan with hatred in his eyes and swore he would personally kill Nikolai Volkov and drag Amelia back to his side no matter what it cost. Despite the shadow of war hanging outside, the weeks that followed became the most peaceful time Amelia had known in many years. Nikolai came to visit her and the children every day, sometimes in the morning before he went to work, sometimes in the evening after tense meetings with members of the organization. He told himself he was only checking on security, that it was the responsibility of a man who had declared he would protect them, yet deep down he knew it was only an excuse to see Amelia's smile and hear the laughter of the 2 children. Emma was the first child to crack the ice around Nikolai. She wasn't afraid of him anymore the way she had been on the first day, and instead she would run to the door whenever she heard his car, eyes shining, calling out loudly that Mr. Nico was here. The first time he heard her call him that, Nikolai froze, not knowing how to react, his heart feeling strangled by a strange emotion he couldn't name. Amelia tried to correct the way Emma addressed him, but Nikolai stopped her and said Mr. Nico is fine. He didn't mind. From then on, Emma always called him Mr. Nico and told him about the books she was reading, about the pictures she was drawing, about her dream of becoming a lawyer so she could protect the weak the way Sister Amelia did. Ethan was even younger, and the boy didn't talk much, but he showed affection in his own way. Every time Nikolai arrived, the 4-year-old would run over and lift both arms, asking to be picked up, his big round eyes looking at Nikolai with the absolute trust only children can give to adults. The first time Nikolai lifted Ethan into his arms, the boy wrapped his arms around Nikolai's neck and rested his head on Nikolai's shoulder, as if it were the safest place in the world. Viktor watched that scene with wide eyes, unable to believe it, because he'd never seen Nikolai Volkov hold a child, never seen that softened expression on the face of the leader who was usually cold as ice. In the evenings, Nikolai began staying for dinner with them. Amelia cooked simple meals from ingredients he'd had delivered, and the small kitchen filled with warm conversation and laughter. Nikolai taught Emma how to play chess at the dining table, while Ethan sat in his lap watching, and now and then he would reach out to poke at the pieces. Amelia stood in the kitchen doorway watching the scene, her heart feeling as if it might break from happiness, because this was something she'd never dared to dream of through the dark years she'd endured. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Amelia and Nikolai sat on the sofa talking. She asked if he remembered how many times he'd come to see them, and Nikolai said he hadn't counted. Amelia smiled and said she had counted, that this was the 18th consecutive day he'd come, and she wanted to thank him for everything he'd done for them. Nikolai looked at her and said he didn't need her thanks. He was doing this because he wanted to, not because of duty. Amelia asked why he wanted to, because he was a powerful man with the world in his hands. So why would he spend time on 3 nameless people like them? Nikolai was quiet for a long time. Then he said that when he was with them he felt like he was alive, that his luxurious penthouse had never been a home. But this place, with Emma's laughter and Ethan's hugs and her smile, this place made him feel as if he had a family. Amelia heard those words and her eyes filled with tears, and she said she felt the same, that he'd given them more than shelter. He'd given them a sense of belonging she thought she'd lost forever. That night, when Nikolai left, he turned back to look at the apartment glowing with warm light and realized his frozen heart had begun to melt at some point, without him even noticing. 1 week later, on a bright moonlit evening, Nikolai came as usual and stayed for dinner with Amelia and the children. Emma and Ethan had grown so used to his presence that they no longer treated him like a guest, but like a member of their small family. After the children had fallen sound asleep, Amelia invited Nikolai out onto the balcony to look at the moon, because tonight the sky was crystal clear and the full moon poured light over the city like a blanket of silver. They stood beside each other in silence for a long moment, the night wind carrying the chill of autumn. Yet neither of them felt cold because the warmth of the other seemed to spread through the air. Amelia turned to Nikolai and noticed his eyes were fixed on something far away, somewhere beyond reach, and she asked what he was thinking about. Nikolai was quiet for a moment, then began to talk about his mother, not in fragments like on the stormy night, but in the deepest memories he'd never shared with anyone. He told her his mother's name was Irina, that she came to America when she was 20 years old with 1 small suitcase and 1 big dream of a better life. She met his father in Brooklyn, a charming man, but an irresponsible one, and when he learned she was pregnant, he left without a single goodbye. His mother gave birth to Nikolai and raised him alone in the small house that Amelia had once taken shelter in. She worked from early morning until late at night, and there were days Nikolai woke up and she was already gone, and when he went to sleep she still hadn't come home. But no matter how tired she was, she always made time to read to him every night, telling him that books would open doors life could never close. Nikolai said that when he was 12, there was a night his mother came home with a bruised face after a drunk man attacked her on the way back, and that was the first time he swore he would become strong so no one could hurt the people he loved. He climbed up from the bottom of society by any means he could, even by ways he knew his mother wouldn't be proud of. And when she died from exhaustion when he was 19, he froze his heart and swore he would never let anyone close again, because he couldn't bear losing one more person who mattered. When he reached that point, Nikolai's voice trembled, and he had to stop to steady himself. Amelia didn't speak. She only reached out and took his hand, her fingers weaving through his gently, as if to say she was here, she was listening, and she understood. Nikolai looked down at the hand holding his, then lifted his gaze to Amelia's face lit by moonlight. Her green eyes shimmered like jewels, and in them he didn't see pity or fear, only understanding, and something warmer that he didn't dare name. He lifted a hand to her cheek, his thumb softly stroking her skin, and in a whisper he asked if she was afraid of him, afraid of the monster he'd become. Amelia shook her head and said she wasn't afraid because she could see who he truly was, the man who held Ethan in his arms, the man who taught Emma chess, the man who drove into a storm to save them, and that man wasn't a monster. Nikolai looked deep into her eyes and slowly leaned down, his lips brushing hers like a question. Amelia didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and kissed him back, and in that moment the world seemed to stop turning. Their kiss was sweet and gentle, carrying every feeling they'd both held back for so long. When they finally parted, Nikolai rested his forehead against hers, and in a voice thick with emotion, he said he would protect her and the children with his life, that he wouldn't let anyone hurt them again, even if he had to trade everything. Amelia smiled through tears and said she believed him, and for the first time in her life she spoke 3 words she thought she'd never dare say to anyone. She said she loved him. Nikolai held her tight under the bright moon and whispered against her ear that he loved her too, more than he'd ever thought he could love anyone. The happy days beside Nikolai made Amelia almost forget that the ghost of the past was still lurking just outside the door. She didn't know that while she was smiling in the arms of the man she loved, Bruno Castellano was sitting in a dark room, quietly planning to take back what he considered his property. Bruno had people watching the apartment where Amelia was staying for the past 2 weeks. He knew her schedule, knew when Nikolai's security detail changed shifts, knew she took her siblings to school every morning at 7:30. He also knew he couldn't confront Volkov's men head-on, because that would ignite a full-scale war before his father had time to prepare their forces. So he chose a more intricate plan, a plan that would be too late to stop by the time Nikolai understood what was happening. Rico was assigned to carry it out, and he bribed a delivery worker to replace the guard's morning coffee with coffee laced with a sedative. On that fateful morning, Amelia woke with a smile on her lips because Nikolai had stayed the night before, and they'd talked until late about the future, about dreams they'd both thought they'd lost long ago. She woke Emma and Ethan, helped them get dressed, and prepared breakfast like she did every day. When she opened the door to take them to the car, she noticed the 2 guards sitting in the hallway looked unusually sluggish, and one of them was even nodding off in his chair. She was about to ask if they were all right when 3 unfamiliar men appeared from the stairwell, faces covered, moving fast as lightning. Amelia screamed and shoved Emma and Ethan back into the apartment, yelling for them to run into the bedroom and lock the door. Emma pulled Ethan into the bedroom while Amelia tried to slam the apartment door shut, but one of the attackers caught it in time and stopped it. She recognized Rico among them even with the mask on, because she could never forget those venomous eyes. Rico gave a vicious smile and said Bruno missed her, and he'd come to bring her home. Amelia fought back, punching, clawing, biting anything she could reach, but she was a thin woman against 3 large men. One of them struck her in the head, leaving her dizzy, and she collapsed to the floor. Meanwhile, Amelia's screams jolted the 2 guards awake even as they were still half lost in the sedative haze. One of them tried to stand and draw his gun, but his head spun so badly he couldn't aim straight. He fired 1 shot into the ceiling as a warning, and the gunshot thundered through the building. Rico knew they didn't have much time, so he ordered his men to carry Amelia out immediately and leave the children behind, because Bruno only wanted her. They dragged Amelia, unconscious, down the stairwell and vanished into a truck waiting in the alley. It all happened in less than 5 minutes. The second guard called Viktor the moment the shot rang out, and just 10 minutes later a Volkov team was on the scene. They broke down the bedroom door and found Emma holding Ethan tight in the corner, both children sobbing and trembling with fear. Emma kept asking over and over where Amelia was, what the bad men had done to Amelia. Nikolai got the news while he was in an important meeting, and he stormed out of the room like a tempest, his gray eyes darkening with a rage no one had ever witnessed. He reached the apartment within 20 minutes, and the first thing he saw was Emma running to him, clinging to his leg and crying that they'd taken Amelia, begging Mr. Nico to save her. Nikolai knelt and pulled both children into his arms, promising he'd bring Amelia back, promising he wouldn't let anyone hurt her. But when he stood and turned to Viktor, his eyes were no longer the eyes of a man in love. They were the eyes of a wild beast ready to kill. He ordered in a voice cold as ice that they were to find where Bruno was hiding her, to tear the whole city apart if necessary, and anyone who got in his way would die. Viktor nodded and began mobilizing the full force of the Volkov syndicate, because this wasn't personal anymore. It was a matter of honor, and no one was allowed to touch someone who belonged to Nikolai Volkov and lived to tell the story. Nikolai looked out the window toward the city and swore Bruno Castellano would pay in blood for what he'd done. Amelia woke in darkness with a sharp, pulsing ache in her head and the stench of damp mold clawing at her lungs. She didn't know where she was, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized she was in an abandoned warehouse with cold concrete walls and a filthy floor coated in dust. Her hands were tied tight to an iron chair, and her legs were chained to the chair's base so she couldn't move. The metal door creaked open with a harsh screech, and Bruno stepped in with a vicious smile, saying his little princess had finally woken up, and how much he'd missed her through the past 6 months. Amelia stared at him with pure contempt and said she'd rather die than go back to him. Bruno laughed loudly and answered that she wasn't going to die, at least not yet, because he had so many things he wanted to do to make up for the time he'd lost. He moved closer and grabbed her hair, yanking her head back, demanding to know if she'd slept with Nikolai Volkov, if she'd let that man touch a body that belonged to him. Amelia spit in his face and said she loved Nikolai, that he was a real man while Bruno was nothing but a disgusting worm. Bruno wiped his face and fury flared in his eyes. He slapped her hard enough to split the corner of her mouth, blood running down her chin. He said she'd pay for that insolence, and pulled a small knife from his coat pocket. The hours that followed were hell for Amelia. Bruno didn't want to kill her. He wanted her to hurt, wanted her to beg, wanted her to say his name and plead for forgiveness. He carved small cuts along her arm, not deep enough to be deadly, but painful enough that she had to clench her teeth to keep her screams trapped inside. Amelia didn't cry or beg. She bit down on her lip and thought of Nikolai, of Emma and Ethan, of the happy days she'd been given. She knew Nikolai would come. She believed he'd find her even if he had to turn the whole world upside down. Meanwhile, Nikolai was like a mad beast tearing through the city to find Amelia. He hadn't slept for 12 hours. his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Every minute that passed was another minute she might be tortured, might be in pain, might be waiting for him to save her. Viktor pulled every source, every connection in the underworld to find where Bruno was hiding Amelia. Finally, on the 12th hour, one of Bruno's men was caught, and after a short interrogation that turned brutally violent, he gave up the location, an abandoned warehouse at the port of Newark, New Jersey. Nikolai didn't wait for anything else. He led his own strike team of 20 fully armed men to Newark's port immediately. They arrived at midnight, darkness smothering the deserted docks, and the target warehouse was guarded by 6 of Bruno's underlings. Nikolai ordered the assault, and the raid unfolded fast and savage. The guards dropped in less than 3 minutes without managing to raise an alarm. Nikolai kicked the warehouse door open and stormed inside, gun in hand, ready to shoot anyone who got in his way. What he saw made the blood in his body seem to freeze and then boil with rage. Amelia sat strapped to the iron chair with torn clothes and blood on her, her arms marked with countless cuts, her face bruised and swollen. Bruno stood beside her with the knife, and when he saw Nikolai, he yanked Amelia up as a shield and pressed the blade to her throat. Bruno screamed that if Nikolai took one more step, he'd slit her throat immediately. Nikolai stopped, his eyes locked on Amelia, and she looked back at him with tears clinging to her lashes, but her spirit still unbroken, whispering that she knew he'd come. Nikolai spoke to Bruno in a voice cold as ice, saying he could lower the knife and die quickly, or he could hurt her again and Nikolai would make sure he died in pain for days. Bruno hesitated for 1 second, and that was all Nikolai needed. He fired a shot that struck the shoulder of Bruno's knife hand, forcing him to drop the weapon and collapse, screaming in agony. Viktor surged in at once and restrained Bruno while Nikolai ran to Amelia, cutting the ropes and chains, then pulling her into his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Amelia sobbed against him, saying she'd been afraid she'd never see him again, never see Emma and Ethan again. Nikolai held her tighter and said in a broken voice that he was sorry. Sorry he hadn't protected her. Sorry he'd let her endure this. Then he lifted her face, looked into her tear-drenched green eyes, and said he loved her more than his own life, and he'd never let anyone hurt her again. Amelia smiled through tears and said she loved him too. That loving him was what had carried her through everything. Nikolai lifted her into his arms and carried her out of that hellish warehouse, Viktor following behind with Bruno in handcuffs, groaning through his wound. On the way back, Nikolai didn't leave her for even a second. He kept kissing her forehead and whispering words of love he'd never spoken to anyone in his life. And Amelia, though pain pulsed through her whole body, felt more peaceful than she ever had, because she knew she'd found where she belonged, in the arms of the man who loved her enough to burn the whole world down for her. News of the raid and the fact that Bruno had been shot and taken into custody spread through New York's underworld in just a few hours. Frank Castellano received the report while he was asleep, and he erupted in rage, smashing whatever was within reach and roaring that Nikolai Volkov would pay in blood for what he'd done to his son. The next morning, Frank sent an official message to every gang and organization in the city, declaring that the Volkov syndicate had attacked the Castellano family, and that this was an act of war, and that anyone who stood with Nikolai would be considered an enemy of the Castellano family. That message hit the underworld like a bomb tossed into a room already filled with gas. Nikolai's allies began to grow anxious, and some reached out to voice their concern. They asked whether this war was worth it, whether one woman was worth sacrificing business ties and the stability they'd spent years building. Nikolai heard those words and said nothing, his eyes cold as ice, because he knew who his real friends were, and who were only opportunists ready to turn their backs the moment trouble arrived. Amelia was being cared for by Dr. Nathan Shaw at Nikolai's penthouse. Her injuries weren't life-threatening, but they needed time to heal. Emma and Ethan had been brought to stay with her, and the children didn't leave her side for even a moment. Emma kept holding Amelia's hand as if she was afraid that if she let go, her sister would disappear again. On the 3rd day after the rescue, Uncle Alexei came to see Nikolai in his office. Alexei Volkov, 60 years old, was the brother of Nikolai's mother, and the only family he had left, the man who'd helped Nikolai build the Volkov syndicate from the earliest days, and had always been his most trusted advisor. But today he came with a worried face and counsel Nikolai didn't want to hear. Alexei said Frank Castellano was rallying every ally he had, that a full-scale war would cost both sides heavily, that many people could die, and everything they'd built might collapse. He suggested Nikolai consider handing Amelia over to Frank in exchange for peace, saying she was only a woman and she wasn't worth sacrificing an empire. Nikolai sprang to his feet and stared at his uncle with an expression Alexei had never seen before, a look full of fury and full of pain. He asked if his uncle remembered his mother, if he remembered how she'd sacrificed everything to protect him, if he remembered the promise he'd sworn at her grave that he'd help Nikolai become a good man. Nikolai said Amelia wasn't a commodity to be traded. She was the woman he loved, the woman who would become his wife, the mother of the children he wanted to have someday. He said that if he had to trade the entire empire to protect her, he'd do it, because he could have all the money and power in the world, and without her his life wouldn't mean a thing. Alexei looked at his nephew and let out a slow breath, then said he understood, and he'd stand by him no matter what happened. He said Nikolai was more like his mother than he realized, loving just as fiercely and just as willing to sacrifice everything for the people he loved. Nikolai embraced his uncle and thanked him for understanding. He knew the war ahead wouldn't be easy, but he didn't have another choice. He would protect Amelia and the children at any cost. He would face Frank Castellano and anyone who dared threaten the small family he'd finally found. And if he had to die, he would die as a man defending what he loved, not as a coward who abandoned the woman he loved in exchange for a false kind of peace. Amelia lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling in the dead of night. The wounds on her body hurt less now, but the wound in her heart didn't. She'd heard the conversation between Nikolai and Uncle Alexei through the half-closed door, and she knew the war was closing in, and it was all because of her. Emma and Ethan were sleeping soundly in the next room. Two innocent children who had no idea their sister was the reason a war could erupt. Amelia decided she couldn't let Nikolai and the people around him suffer for her anymore. She had to leave. She had to disappear so Bruno and Frank would have no reason left to attack the Volkov syndicate. She rose quietly and began packing her things into a small bag. She would wake Emma and Ethan and slip away before dawn while everyone was still asleep. She wrote a letter to Nikolai, tears falling and blurring the ink as she wrote that she loved him. But she couldn't let him die for her, that he deserved happiness with someone who didn't carry a past as tangled as hers. She had barely folded the letter when the bedroom door flew open, and Nikolai walked in, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness and his face tight with anger. He asked what she was doing in a voice gone cold, and when he saw the packed bag on the bed, he understood everything. He strode over, snatched the letter from her hand and skimmed it, then crushed it in his fist and threw it to the floor, fury blazing in his eyes. He demanded what she thought she was doing, whether she thought she could leave as if he didn't exist, whether she thought he'd let her walk away from him again. Amelia cried and said she was doing it because she loved him, because she didn't want him to die or lose everything because of her, because she was only an ordinary girl and he was the head of an empire. Nikolai stepped in, grabbed her shoulders, and stared straight into her eyes as he said she didn't understand anything, that his empire meant nothing without her, that he'd been living like an empty shell for the past 18 years until he met her. He told her she'd awakened the dead heart inside him. She'd given him a reason to become better. She'd given him a family he thought he'd never have. Amelia shook her head and said she didn't deserve everything he'd done for her, that she was only a girl who'd been sold like merchandise and beaten like an animal. Nikolai cupped her face in both hands and said her past didn't define her, that she was the strongest woman he'd ever met, the woman who had raised 2 siblings alone in desperate circumstances, the woman who had never given up even when life drove her to the edge of hopelessness. Then Nikolai did something she never could have imagined. He dropped to one knee in front of her and pulled a small velvet box from his coat. He opened it, and inside was a simple silver ring with a small stone that caught the light, and he said it had been his mother's ring, the only thing she'd left him, and he wanted her to wear it as a promise that she would stay with him forever. He asked if she would agree to be his wife, if she would agree to let him protect her and the children for the rest of his life, if she would agree to build a real family with him. Amelia looked at the man kneeling in front of her, the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, down on one knee proposing to a woman who had nothing but 2 children and a past made of scars. She cried and nodded, and she said yes, she would be his wife. She would stay with him no matter what came. She would face everything beside him and never run again. Nikolai rose and slid the ring onto her finger, then kissed her with all the love and relief he'd been carrying through days of tension. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered that she had turned him into the kind of man his mother would be proud of. Amelia smiled through tears and said she would try to be worthy of the ring, and worthy of the love he gave her. That night they lay together until the first light of dawn, and Amelia knew that no matter how brutal the war ahead might be, she would never leave this man again. After the night of the proposal, Nikolai knew he couldn't let the war drag on any longer, because every day that passed was another day. Amelia and the children had to live in fear. He needed to end it decisively, but not with blood and violence, with strategy, by forcing Frank Castellano to destroy himself. Nikolai had secretly collected evidence of the Castellano family's illegal operations for years, from drug trafficking to money laundering and contract killings. He had documents, recordings, witnesses ready to testify, and Frank had never suspected a thing. Nikolai had never used any of it because in the underworld there was an unspoken rule that you never run to the police. But this time Nikolai was willing to break that rule to protect his family. He contacted an FBI agent he knew who had been chasing the Castellano case for years, and offered an exchange of information on the condition that the Volkov syndicate would be granted immunity from prosecution. The agent agreed because the evidence Nikolai provided was enough to lock Frank and Bruno up for the rest of their lives. 1 week later, the FBI carried out the largest raid in the city's history against the Castellano family's operations. Frank was arrested at his mansion along with more than 24 high-level men. And Bruno, still in the hospital from the wound he took the night Amelia was rescued, was handcuffed right on his hospital bed. Additionally, the authorities tracked down Amelia's stepfather, charging him with child endangerment and human trafficking, ensuring he would spend his remaining years behind bars alongside the Castellanos. The news spread through the underworld, and everyone understood that Nikolai Volkov had won without firing a single additional shot. Some criticized him for breaking the rule, but most admired his intelligence and his ruthlessness, because only Nikolai Volkov would dare turn the FBI into his weapon. When Amelia heard Frank and Bruno had been arrested, she couldn't believe it. She had braced herself for a bloody war, had prepared to lose Nikolai at any moment, and now the ghost that had haunted her for years was finally gone. She held Nikolai tight and sobbed, not from grief but from relief, because for the first time in her life she felt truly free. 3 months later, when everything had settled and Amelia's injuries had fully healed, Nikolai held their wedding at the old house in Brooklyn, where it had all begun. The house had been completely renovated, but it still kept the warm, simple feeling Amelia had created when she first turned it into a home. The wedding was small, with only about 30 guests, most of them Nikolai's closest people, along with a few women from the domestic violence support center Amelia had come to know during her recovery. Viktor stood beside Nikolai as the witness, and that loyal man cried when he saw Amelia walk in wearing a simple white dress that still looked breathtaking. Emma was the little flower girl in a pink dress, with a wreath of flowers on her head, and Ethan wore a tiny suit and carried the ring pillow with an adorably serious face. When Amelia reached Nikolai, he looked at her as if he was seeing an angel, and his gray eyes shone with a light Viktor had never once seen through all the years he'd stood at his side. They exchanged vows to love and protect each other for life, to face every hardship together, and to build a happy family. When Nikolai kissed his bride, everyone clapped, and Emma jumped up cheering while Ethan simply stood there grinning from ear to ear. Uncle Alexei sat in the front row wiping away tears, whispering to the person beside him that his sister was surely smiling in heaven to see her son happy like this. After the ceremony, Nikolai and Amelia announced something else. They had officially completed the adoption paperwork for Emma and Ethan, and from now on the children would carry the Volkov name and would be their children under the law. Emma cried when she heard it and threw her arms around Nikolai, the man she now called Dad Nico, while Ethan climbed into his lap, kissed his cheek, and said he loved him. Nikolai gathered both children into his arms and looked at Amelia with tears in his eyes, telling her he had everything he'd ever wanted, a loving wife and wonderful children. That night, after all the guests had gone, the little family of 4 sat together in the living room of the old house. Emma read to Ethan from the very books Nikolai had let her keep on the first day they met, while Nikolai and Amelia sat beside them watching with eyes full of love. Amelia rested her head on her husband's shoulder and said she couldn't believe life had changed so much in only a few months, from a homeless girl on the run to the wife of one of the most powerful men in the city. Nikolai kissed her forehead and said she'd given him more than he'd ever given her. She'd given him a reason to live and to become a better man. And in the small Brooklyn house that had once witnessed Nikolai's poor childhood and Amelia's months of running, there was now nothing but laughter and the happiness of a real family. 5 years after the wedding, life for the Volkov family had changed completely in ways no one could have predicted. Nikolai had gradually shifted most of his operations onto the legal path, investing in real estate, restaurants, and technology companies, building a clean business empire he could be proud to leave to his children. He still carried influence in the underworld, but he no longer took part directly in dangerous work. Viktor now ran most of those affairs while Nikolai made room for his family. The old house in Brooklyn became their official home after it was completely rebuilt. Nikolai wanted his children to grow up where he'd lived his own childhood, so they'd understand there was nothing shameful about humble beginnings and that real success comes from love and perseverance. Amelia gave Nikolai a bright, beautiful little girl 2 years after the wedding, and they named her Natasha after Nikolai's mother. Natasha had her father's gray eyes and her mother's brown hair. She was the light of the whole family, and she was adored by Emma and Ethan. Emma was 12 now, just as smart and hardworking as she'd been the first day Nikolai met her. She still loved reading and had declared she would become a lawyer to protect women and children who'd been abused like Amelia once was. Ethan was 9, a boy who clung to Dad Nikolai and wanted to become a doctor so he could heal people. Amelia wasn't only a wonderful wife and mother, she also found a mission that belonged to her alone. She opened a support center for abused women right there in Brooklyn, where she'd lived through her darkest days. The center offered safe shelter, legal support, and job training for women trying to escape toxic relationships. Amelia spent her time listening to their stories, sharing what she'd lived through, and giving them hope that life can change if they're brave enough to take the first step. 10 years later, when Natasha was 8, Emma 17, and Ethan 14, the Volkov family had become a symbol of change and hope. Nikolai had fully walked away from the underworld and became a respected businessman. He donated often to charities and mentored young people from difficult backgrounds the way he once was. Amelia's center had expanded into a network with 5 locations across New York and had helped more than 1,000 women rebuild their lives. Emma had been accepted into a prestigious law school and was on her way to making her dream real, and Ethan had earned a full scholarship to a top medical school. Viktor was still beside the family like a beloved uncle. He'd retired and spent his days teaching Ethan chess and telling Natasha adventure stories from his younger years. Uncle Alexei passed away peacefully at 75. Surrounded by those who loved him, and Nikolai cried like a child at his funeral. On an autumn evening, the whole family sat together around the dinner table in the Brooklyn house. Natasha was talking about her first day of school. Emma was helping Ethan study, and Nikolai was looking at his wife with the same unwavering love even after 10 years. Amelia caught that look and smiled, asking him what he was thinking about. Nikolai said he was thinking about the first day he'd seen her standing at the door of this house, eyes full of fear and yet full of fierce strength. And he still couldn't believe that woman had completely changed his life. Amelia took her husband's hand and said she couldn't believe the cold, terrifying man from that day had become the love of her life, the man who'd pulled her out of the dark and given her a family she'd never dared to dream of. They kissed, and all 3 children groaned and teased that Mom and Dad were being sweet again, laughter filling the house like a song of happiness. The story of Nikolai and Amelia is proof that no past is too dark to rise above. No heart is too frozen to melt under love. Sometimes the best families aren't built by blood, but by choice and devotion. Sometimes miracles happen when we dare to open our hearts to strangers and give them a chance to become part of our lives. And sometimes, the people life has treated most cruelly are the ones with the kindest hearts, because they understand the value of goodness and compassion. If you're enjoying this story, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more touching stories every day. How do you feel about Nikolai and Amelia's story? Do you believe love can change a person? Have you ever met someone who changed your life completely? We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart. So leave a comment below so we can connect and spread more good values in life together. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of the video. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and days filled with happiness and peace. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.